Until 1960, the University College of Fort Hare in the municipality of Alice, about 20 miles due east from Hilltown, was the only residential center of higher education for blacks in South Africa. Fort Hare was more than that. It was a beacon for African scholars from all over southern, central, and eastern Africa. For young black South Africans like me, it was Oxford and Cambridge, Harvard and Yale, all rolled into one. The regent was anxious for me to attend Fort Hare, and I was pleased to be accepted there. Before I went up to the university, the regent bought me my first suit, double breasted in grey. The suit made me feel grown up and sophisticated. I was 21 years old and could not imagine anyone at Fort Hare smarter than I. I felt that I was being groomed for success in the world. I was pleased that the regent would now have a member of his clan with a university degree. Justice had remained at Hilltown to work for his junior certificate. He enjoyed playing more than studying and was an indifferent scholar. Fort Hare had been founded in 1916 by Scottish missionaries on the site of what was the largest 19th century frontier fort in the Eastern Cape. Built on a rocky platform and moated by the winding arc of the Tayume River, Fort Hare was perfectly situated to enable the British to fight the gallant Xhosa warrior, Sandile, the last Rehoboam king, who was defeated by the British in one of the final frontier battles in the 1800s. Fort Hare had only 150 students, and I already knew a dozen or so of them from Clagberry and Hilltown. One of them, who I was meeting for the first time, was KD Matanzima. Though KD was my nephew according to tribal hierarchy, I was younger and far less senior to him. Tall and slender and extremely confident, KD was a third-year student and he took me under his wing. I looked up to him as I had to Justice. We were both Methodists, and I was assigned to his hostel known as Wesley House, a pleasant two-story building on the edge of the campus. Under his tutelage, I attended church services with him at nearby Lovedale, took up soccer, in which he excelled, and generally followed his advice. The regent did not believe in sending money to his children at school, and I would have had empty pockets had not KD shared his allowance with me. Like the regent, he saw my future role as counselor to Sabata, and he encouraged me to study law. Fort Hare, like Clagberry and Hilltown, was a missionary college. We were exhorted to obey God, respect the political authorities, and be grateful for the educational opportunities afforded to us by the church and the government. These schools have often been criticized for being colonialist in their attitudes and practices. Yet, even with such attitudes, I believe their benefits outweighed their disadvantages. The missionaries built and ran schools when the government was unwilling or unable to do so. The learning environment of the missionary schools, while often morally rigid, was far more open than the racist principles underlying government schools. Fort Hare was both home and incubator of some of the greatest African scholars the continent has ever known. Professor Z.K. Matthews was the very model of the intellectual. A child of a miner, Z.K. had been influenced by Booker Washington's autobiography, Up from Slavery, which preached success through hard work and moderation. He taught social anthropology and African law and spoke out bluntly against the government's social policies. Fort Hare and Professor D.G.T. Japuvo are virtually synonymous. He was the first member of staff when the university opened in 1916. Professor Jabuvo had been awarded a degree in English from the University of London, which seemed an impossibly rare feat. Professor Jabuvo taught Xhosa as well as Latin, history, and anthropology. He was an encyclopedia when it came to Xhosa genealogy and told me facts about my father that I had never known. He was also a persuasive spokesman for African rights, becoming the founding president of the All-African Conventions in 1936, which opposed legislation in parliament designed to end the common voter's role in the Cape. I recall once traveling from Fort Hare to Umtata by train, riding in the African compartment, in which were the only seats open to blacks. The white train inspector came to check our tickets. When he saw that I had got on at Alice, he said, "Are you from Jabuwu school?" I nodded yes. Whereupon the conductor cheerfully punched my ticket and mumbled something about Jabuwu being a fine man. In my first year, I studied English, anthropology, politics, native administration, and Roman Dutch law. Native administration dealt with the laws relating to Africans and was advisable for anyone who wanted to work in the Native Affairs Department. Although KD was counseling me to study law, I had my heart set on being an interpreter or a clerk in the Native Affairs Department. At that time, a career as a civil servant was a glittering prize for an African, the highest that a black man could aspire to. In the rural areas, an interpreter in the magistrate's office was considered second only in importance to the magistrate himself. When, in my second year, Fort Hare introduced an interpreting course taught by a distinguished retired court interpreter, Tim Zashe, I was one of the first students to sign up. Fort Hare could be a rather elitist place and was not without the problems common to many institutions of higher learning. Seniors treated the juniors with haughtiness and disdain. When I first arrived on campus, I spotted Gamaliel Wabaza across the central courtyard. He was several years older and I had been with him at Clarkbury. I greeted him warmly, but his response was exceedingly cool and superior, and he made a disparaging remark about the fact that I would be staying in the freshman dormitory. Wabaza then informed me that he was on the house committee of my dormitory even though, as a senior, he no longer shared the dormitory. I found this odd and undemocratic, but it was the accepted practice. One night, not long after that, a group of us discussed the fact that no residents of freshmen were represented on the house committee. We decided that we would depart from tradition and elect a house committee made up of these two groups. We held discussions and lobbied all the residents of the house, and within weeks elected our own house committee, defeating the seniors. I myself was one of the organizers and was elected to this newly constituted committee. But the seniors were not so easily subdued. They held a meeting at which one of them, Rex Tatani, an eloquent English speaker, said, "This behavior on the part of freshers is unacceptable. How can we seniors be overthrown by a backward fellow from the countryside like Mandela, a fellow who cannot even speak English properly?" Then he proceeded to mimic the way I spoke, giving me what he perceived to be a Gaelic accent, at which his own clerk laughed heartily. Tatani's kneading speech made us all more resolute. We freshers now constituted the official house committee, and we assigned the seniors the most unpleasant task, which was a great indignity for them. The warden of the college, Reverend A.J. Cook, learned of this dispute and called us into his office. We felt we had right on our side and were not prepared to yield. Tatani appealed to the warden to overrule us, and in the midst of his speech broke down and wept. The warden asked us to modify our stand, but we would not bend. Like most bullies, Tatani had a brittle but fragile exterior. We informed the warden that if he overruled us, we would all resign from the house committee, depriving the committee itself of any integrity or authority. In the end, the warden decided not to intervene. We had remained firm and we had won. This was one of my first battles with authority, and I felt the sense of power that comes from having right and justice on one side. I would not be so lucky in the future in my fight against the authorities at the college. My education at Fort Hare was as much outside as inside the classroom. I was a more active sportsman than I had been at Hilltown. This was due to two factors. I had grown taller and stronger, but more important, Fort Hare was so much smaller than Hilltown that I had less competition. I was able to compete in both soccer and cross-country running. Running taught me valuable lessons. In cross-country competition, training counted more than intrinsic ability, and I could compensate for a lack of natural aptitude with diligence and discipline. I applied this in everything I did. Even as a student, I saw many young men who had great natural ability but who did not have the self discipline and patience to build on their endowment. I also joined the Drama Society and acted in a play about Abraham Lincoln that was adapted by my classmate Lincoln McIntyre. McIntyre came from a distinguished Transkean family and was another fellow whom I looked up to. This was literally true, as he was the only student at Fort Hare taller than I was. McIntyre portrayed his namesake while I played John Wilkes Booth, Lincoln's assassin. McIntyre's depiction of Lincoln was stately and formal, and his recitation of one of the greatest of all speeches, the Gettysburg Address, won a standing ovation. My part was the smaller one, though I was the engine of the play's moral, which was that men who take great risks often suffer great consequences. I became a member of the Students' Christian Association and taught Bible classes on Sundays in neighboring villages. One of my comrades on these expeditions was a serious young science scholar whom I had met on the soccer field. He came from Pondoland in the Transkei and his name was Oliver Tambo. From the start, I saw that Oliver's intelligence was diamond-etched. He was a keen debater and did not accept the platitudes that so many of us automatically subscribe to. Oliver lived in Beta Hall, the Anglican hostel, and though I did not have much contact with him at Fort Hare, it was easy to see that he was destined for great things. On Sundays, a group of us would sometimes walk into Alice to have a meal at one of the restaurants in town. The restaurant was run by whites, and in those days it was inconceivable for a black man to walk in at the front door, much less take a meal in the dining room. Instead, we would pool our resources, go round to the kitchen and order what we wanted. I learned not only about physics at Fort Hare, but another precise physical science, ballroom dancing. To a crackly old phonograph in the dining hall, we spent hours practicing foxtrots and waltzes, each of us taking turns leading and following. Our idol was Victor Sylvester, the world champion of ballroom dancing, and our tutor was a fellow student, Smalley Sivilindla, who seemed a younger version of the master. In a neighboring village, there was an African dance hall known as Nishimanzi, which catered to the cream of local black society and was off limits to undergraduates. But one night, desperate to practice our steps with the gentler sex, we put on our suits, stole out of our dormitory, and made it to the dance hall. It was a sumptuous place, and we felt very daring. I noticed a lovely young woman across the floor and politely asked her to dance. A moment later, she was in my arms. We moved well together, and I imagined what a striking figure I was cutting on the floor. After a few minutes, I asked her name. Mrs. Bockway, she said softly. I almost dropped her on the spot and scampered off the floor. I glanced across the floor and saw Dr. Rosebery Bockway, one of the most respected African leaders and scholars of the time, chatting with his brother-in-law and my professor Z.K. Matthews. I apologized to Mrs. Bockway and then sheepishly escorted her to the side under the curious eyes of Dr. Bowe and Professor Matthews. I wanted to sink beneath the floorboards. I had violated any number of university regulations. But Professor Matthews, who was in charge of discipline at Fort Hare, never said a word to me. He was willing to tolerate what he considered high spirits as long as it was balanced by hard work. I don't think I ever studied more diligently than in the weeks after an evening at Nishimanzi. Fort Hare was characterized by a level of sophistication, both intellectual and social, that was new and strange to me. By Western standards, Fort Hare's worldliness may not seem much, but to a country boy like myself, it was a revelation. I wore pajamas for the first time, finding them uncomfortable in the beginning, but gradually growing used to them. I had never used a toothbrush and toothpaste before. At home, we used ash to whiten our teeth and toothpicks to clean them. The water flush toilets and hot water showers were also a novelty to me. I used toilet soap for the first time, not the blue detergent that I had washed with for so many years at home. Perhaps, as a result of all this unfamiliarity, I yearned for some of the simple pleasures that I had known as a boy. I was not alone in this feeling, and I joined a group of young men who engaged in secret evening expeditions to the university's farmland, where we built a fire and roasted mealies. We would then sit around eating the ears of corn and telling tall tales. We did not do this because we were hungry, but out of a need to recapture what was most homelike to us. We boasted about our conquests, our athletic prowess, and how much money we were going to make once we had graduated. Although I felt myself to be a sophisticated young fellow, I was still a country boy who missed country pleasures. While Fort Hare was a sanctuary removed from the world, we were keenly interested in the progress of the Second World War. Like my classmates, I was an ardent supporter of Great Britain, and I was enormously excited to learn that the speaker at the university's graduation ceremony at the end of my first year would be England's great advocate in South Africa, the former Prime Minister Jan Smuts. It was a great honor for Fort Hare to play host to a man acclaimed as a world statesman. Smuts, then Deputy Prime Minister, was campaigning around the country for South Africa to declare war on Germany, while the Prime Minister J.B. Hertzog advocated neutrality. I was extremely curious to see a world leader like Smuts up close. While Hertzog had 3 years earlier led the drive to remove the last African voters from the common voters' role in the CAP, I found Smuts a sympathetic figure. I cared more that he had helped to found the League of Nations, promoting freedom around the world, than the fact that he had repressed freedom at home. Smuts spoke about the importance of supporting Great Britain against the Germans, and the idea that England stood for the same Western values that we as South Africans stood for. I remember thinking that his accent in English was almost as poor as mine. Along with my fellow classmates, I heartily applauded him, cheering Smuts' call to do battle for the freedom of Europe, forgetting that we did not have that freedom here in our own land. Smuts was preaching to the converted at Fort Hare. Each evening, the warden of Wesley House used to review the military situation in Europe, and late at night we would huddle around an old radio and listen to BBC broadcasts of Winston Churchill's stirring speeches. But even though we supported Smuts' position, his visit provoked much discussion. During one session, a contemporary of mine, Neathi Kongisa, who was considered an extremely clever fellow, condemned Smuts as a racist. He said that we might consider ourselves black Englishmen, but the English had oppressed us at the same time that they tried to civilize us. Whatever the mutual antagonism between Boer and British, he said, the two white groups would unite to confront the black threat. Kongisa's views stunned us and seemed dangerously radical. A fellow student whispered to me that Nyathi was a member of the African National Congress, an organization that I had vaguely heard of but knew very little about. Following South Africa's declaration of war against Germany, Hertzog resigned and Smuts became Prime Minister. During my second year at Fort Hare, I invited my friend Paul Mahabane to spend the winter holidays with me in the Transkei. Paul was from Bloemfontein and was well known on campus because his father, the Reverend Jessius Mahabane, had twice been President General of the African National Congress. His connection with this organization, about which I still knew very little, gave him the reputation of a rebel. One day during the holiday, Paul and I went to Umtata, the capital of the Transkei, which then consisted of a few paved streets and some government buildings. We were standing outside the post office when the local magistrate, a white man in his 60s, approached Paul and asked him to go inside to buy him some postage stamps. It was quite common for any white person to call on any black person to perform a chore. The magistrate attempted to hand Paul some change, but Paul would not take it. The magistrate was offended. "Do you know who I am?" he said. His face turned red with irritation. "It is not necessary to know who you are," Mahabane said. "I know what you are." The magistrate asked him exactly what he meant by that. "I mean that you are a rogue," Paul said heatedly. The magistrate boiled over and exclaimed, "You will pay dearly for this," and then walked away. I was extremely uncomfortable with Paul's behavior. While I respected his courage, I also found it disturbing. The magistrate knew precisely who I was, and I knew that if he had asked me rather than Paul, I would have simply performed the errand and forgotten about it. But I admired Paul for what he had done, even though I was not yet ready to do the same myself. I was beginning to realize that a black man did not have to accept the dozens of petty indignities directed at him each day. After my holiday, I returned to school early in the new year, feeling strong and renewed. I concentrated on my studies, leading to examinations in October. In a year's time, I imagined that I would have a BA, just like clever Gertrude Nithabai. A university degree, I believed, was a passport not only to community leadership but to financial success. We had been told over and over again by the principal, Dr. Alexander Kerr, and Professors Jabubu and Matthews how, as graduates of Fort Hare, we were the African elite. I believed that the world would be at my feet. As a BA, I would finally be able to restore to my mother the wealth and prestige that she had lost after my father's death. I would build her a proper home in Kunu, with a garden and modern furniture and fittings. I would support her and my sister so that they could afford the things they had so long been denied. This was my dream and seemed within reach.